Welcome back to the Care Team Podcast, October 28th, 2021, episode 59, Romans 12:2, Change Your Mind, Change Your Life. And today we're excited to talk about the conference that we just got back from. It's called The Comeback. It was at North Coast Church in Vista, California. And you might have realized that we kind of recycled a few of our older episodes, and that's why. And we're excited to come and share that with you.
Yeah, so glad to be back. And as we dive into this topic, we just kind of want to have a nice soft start in there. So we know it's autumn. Autumn has definitely hit us hard yesterday. Get your jackets, folks.
Yep.
Or inside joke, and maybe we'll explain it. Get your parka.
That's right.
Sorry, it's an inside joke. But anyway, so as we dive in today, it's autumn. And so we just kind of want to talk about some of our favorite things we do in autumn, if it's a specific family thing or maybe like an autumn life hack.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, I love the foods that come along with autumn. I like food anyway, but really love the cooler air, the leaves, but then also that hearty food that comes along. And pumpkin pie is delicious, but my motto is chocolate improves most foods. And
yes.
So my hack is you're making and preparing your pumpkin pies. This is really easy. Take about a half a cup to 3/4 of a cup of chocolate chips, and I really recommend just probably not semi-sweet, maybe milk chocolate, and put that in the pie shell as you pour in the pumpkin pie mix and bake it as you normally bake it. And when you're all done, there'll be this great little thin layer of chocolate. And it's an awesome addition. I know some people say don't mess with a traditional thing, but you don't knock it until you've tried it.
Yeah. I may have to try that one.
Yeah. So this year we did something new, and actually when I can't even say we because it was all Jill. So anyways, we went out to my father-in-law's garden where he had all kinds of pumpkins, and unbeknownst to me, he had pie pumpkins. So she picked one of those, brought it inside the house, gutted it, used all that stuff for pumpkin mousse.
Yeah.
And then put it back into the pumpkin, and that's what we dipped it out of.
Oh, cool.
Fancy.
Yeah.
Wow.
That sounds cool.
Yeah, that was really cool. It was really tasty, too.
Yeah.
Good job, Jill.
So I already knew this, but Jill has her stuff together way more than I do. So fall, I love fall. It's beautiful. The weather's beautiful. Food's amazing. But I usually am just busy mourning the loss of summer during fall. So I don't usually put out a lot of decorations or do a whole lot of specific things.
Though, too.
That is true. I do love the campfires. But one year in particular, this is like 3 years ago or something, I was driving home and, the leaves are falling. It's beautiful. And I thought, gosh, I never did get a pumpkin. Never, really like decorated or anything. And I drove up and I was so excited because I looked on my front porch and there's, I see what I think is this big orange pumpkin. I'm like, somebody brought me a pumpkin and put it on my porch. I was so excited. And I walked out there to look. My son had left his basketball in the landscaping. And I thought it was like,
yes.
This is great. It was so easy. And
That's great. So is your hack that you can decorate with basketballs?
Yes, that is my hack.
I like
Yeah.
There
it.
you
I
go.
like it.
Who's your fans? There you go.
I feel like my hack is just, I also love summer. So when it starts to get cold, I can't really enjoy fall because I'm just like, it's almost winter. And I do not like winter at all because I get cold and I stay cold.
I'm with you.
So my thing is always layer just as much as you need to, but also like, I don't know. So like inside, you're not like wearing a ton of layers and you're super hot and you can't like take them off. So I'm always like, just wear layers so you can keep warm when you're outside. And then when you're inside, you can just be comfortable. So.
Nice. Well, as we dive into our topic today, so we're talking about the conference topics, and the conference was called The Comeback. And it was just interesting, their play on words. And but before we get started, and so what we're going to do today, each person went to different breakout sessions, and we're going to talk a little about the breakout session we went to and how that applies to care and why we should use that or why we should consider that when it comes to care topics. So, but Tom, can you talk about what comeback meant and what they meant by that?
Yeah, I did, and I wanted to also share just some musings that I had about that title. They were calling it the comeback because for most of us in different ways, COVID was kind of a timeout, for lack of a better way to describe it. Many people I've talked to said it feels like we lost a year or time sort of skipped a beat. And I think for a lot of leaders, pastors, and even just church members, it really feels like a return to trying to get back to normalcy or coming back into our jobs fully or whatever it is. And so that was kind of the idea. And it was interesting because it felt to me, I'm just being transparent here, it felt to me a little after the fact. But once we started really diving into the conference and parsing through some of the kind of 30,000 foot, view points that they had, it made a lot of sense. I have to tell you, though, I immediately thought of the LL Cool J song, "Don't Call It a Comeback, I've Been Here," and there's some truth in that as well, right? Like on one hand, it is a comeback, but on the other hand, a lot of us were either viewing church online or doing church online, or on both ends of that. And so we were here. We didn't leave, but we were here in a different manner.
Yeah.
So anyway, it was an excellent conference, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you guys have to say about your experience there.
So Callie, you're going to lead us off. What class did you go to? What was what are some things you took away that our listeners can apply to the topics we normally talk about?
Yeah. I think the most influential speaker that I heard, her name was Megan Fate Marshman. And I don't remember exactly the title of hers because I didn't write it down. But she was just really vulnerable about all the stuff she had encountered this year and like through COVID. And apparently even earlier in the year, she had lost someone really close to her. And she was just left in a really broken spot for a while. And I love when people can be very vulnerable to a crowd and they can just be very open. And I think that's something that we can easily like skip over as believers. I think sometimes we fail to be vulnerable with one another, and then, we can't really meet people where they're at because people feel so alone and isolated because they feel like people don't understand what they're feeling and where they're coming from.
Did you feel at all when you were listening to her? Because I enjoyed her very much too. In fact, I got her books later.
Mm-hmm.
Did you notice or feel that I did? Like here she is talking about this really significant loss and then talking about all the heavy topics. And yet you could feel an underlying joy.
Yeah, she was very joyful on stage. She had a very joyful presence. And the thing I loved about her was she was joyful, but when she started to feel emotion on stage, she didn't back away from that. Like you could see her eyes get watery. You could see that she was very much feeling things very deeply at that time, but it didn't embarrass her. It didn't push her away from feeling those things. But yeah, she did have a lot of joy on stage, and she had that presence and that light about her that was really encouraging.
Well, and I think that's an opportunity too to talk about the difference between happiness versus joy, because it's not a happy moment, but there's joy because that God wins in the end.
Yeah.
One of the casualties of COVID was our interaction with one another, and I couldn't help but feel from all the speakers, and especially who you're talking about, that we value realness maybe more now even than we did before, that we value so much communication and relationship and interaction that we see right through a phony interaction.
Yeah.
And so I felt from majority, if not all of the speakers, this real connection with the audience and purposeful connection.
Yeah, for sure. I think she had a few big points that I really liked that I wanted to share. One of the biggest ones was kind of towards the beginning of her message, and she was just saying we want to be like Jesus, but we don't want to carry our cross. And I was very convicted about that. I was like, I don't know if y'all are at all interested in the Enneagram, but I am a 2. I am a helper. I like to be present with people in their pain, but when it comes to my pain, I really struggle with feeling it and internalizing it and sitting with it and healing from that. But, being like Jesus, we do have to carry those things, and we have to carry our cross, and we have to die to self. And I think that's a really hard thing for every believer, is getting to that point where we're like, okay, God, like I'm fully surrendering to you. And I think even sometimes we've been believers for a long time and we don't want to fully surrender because we still want that part of ourselves. We still want that flesh. Like, does that make sense? Like,
yeah, that's a really good point.
Absolutely. And implied in there is we want to be like Jesus, but we don't want to carry our cross. You can't. Jesus says to us, right, pick up your cross and follow me. So you can't. You might desire to, and it's good to have that desire, but if you're not willing to carry that cross, you can't.
Yeah.
I think too about Jim's message the weekend before the conference, and he talked about being separated from God versus being, found being justified by God, because we're believers, and how a lot of people, they try to walk that line. It's like, how can I walk that line between getting all the sinful things that I want, but also still being acceptable to Christ? And it's like, you can't.
Yeah.
You got to go with what Jesus wants, and so dying to self.
That's good.
Another thing that she brought up was just to wait more on the Lord. And we as the care team went to dinner one night, and I actually had brought up, like, what is a fruit of the Spirit that you struggle with the most? And one of my top ones was patience. I'm like, no, I want it. I want it now. If God tells me to do something, I want to do it then. I don't want to wait. But sometimes that is a big part of our relationship with God, is just waiting on him, and in that just being present to him and like what he's trying to, share with us and show us and tell us in those waiting seasons. So, and I feel like I'm kind of in a, season of waiting right now, and just like being prepared to, I know we've talked about me going to Romania soon on one of these podcasts. So, preparing that and like waiting on that season. And so, there's just a lot there for that too. And I was like, okay, God, I need to learn to be still, and I just need to learn to be present with you more instead of just trying to figure things out,
I think we joked around about a play on words with that as well, that when you are trying to be patient and you're struggling, that getting out of self and focusing on others. And so that idea of waiting on the Lord, almost like wait staff at a restaurant, like, are you serving God? And usually the way we serve God is we serve others. And so when I'm thinking about you and what you need and serving you, I'm not thinking about me and what I'm worried about and what I'm waiting on. So just kind of a play on words there. But yeah, I was so glad you brought that up, Callie, because that was great conversation following that day and what we heard.
It was.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's probably one of my favorite parts of the trip, was just having those conversations with you all at the end of the day. Yeah. I'll share one more big thing that I really liked. She was talking about the story of Noah in the ark, and she was just talking about how once everyone was in the ark, she's like, God sealed the door shut. And I remembered like thinking about that, and I was like, yeah, like we know that God shut the door. But then she said this, and it was very simple, but it was really profound to me. And she just said, God shuts the doors, he doesn't just open them. And I thought, I'm somebody who sometimes I feel like I'm going to miss what God has for me somehow. And I feel like that's kind of a normal feeling. But for me, I was like, okay, like God will shut the things off from me that aren't serving me if I'm seeking him. So that just was a very big comforting thing for me to hear too. But she was full of wisdom. I loved hearing her speak. She was probably one of my favorite parts of the whole conference. She was awesome.
Yeah. So Lori, how about yourself?
Well, she was really great, and Tom mentioned that he bought her books, and I didn't buy a book, but I borrowed one of them from Tom, so I'm excited to start reading it. The whole conference and experience was great. It was really cool that we got to sit outside for half the conference in the sunshine and got to hear the speakers, and all the speakers were so good. And Tom talked about the realness of them, and I appreciate authenticity in people so much that I didn't feel like anyone was being somebody they're not, putting on airs. They were just comfortable, and I really appreciate it and like that. It was entertaining and informative and, moving and all those things. One of my favorite parts of the conference was I went to a breakout about North Coast singles ministry. So I was pretty excited to hear about that. I have been single for about 6 years now. When I first found myself an unmarried person, your whole kind of life changed. You don't know what to do with yourself anymore. You don't have your married couple friends to go out with. Your single friends are busy, and it's kind of a whole new phase of life. And at that time when I found myself, trying to just adjust to that and looking for places, to be and things to do, or, I just ran into, there's just not a lot out there, and over the last few years, I've talked about it before, we've brought our single and parenting support group to the church, which is a great step for us. I think it's really helpful, and it's a good place for single people to bond together. But North Coast has an amazing singles ministry, and there were two pastors that talked. I don't have their names written down, but they were both from, two different generations, one that was a little younger, one that was a little older, which I thought was good. Mm-hmm. And their singles ministry is broken down into 3 different age groups, like 15 or so years time span. And the way they're set up is they meet on a regular basis. They do teaching, and then they also have single small groups. Mm. And then I think once a month or so they do an event or a serving project and things like that. And it's based on kind of just age groups. And the intent obviously is not to, it's not a dating site. It's not, mm-hmm. If you happen to meet someone, they're great, but that's not the intent. That's not the focus, which I think sometimes is the perception of singles mm-hmm. ministry. That it's a meat market or it's whatever. But, really people just want people to be with. Mm-hmm. So I really like that. They talked about some of the pastoring they do with people who just struggle with being single, mm-hmm. who struggle for whatever reason, and help them find their identity in other things rather than their their marital status or whatever. And also they talked about that kind of odd stage sometimes you have where you're not single, you're not married, you're in a committed relationship, but where do you fit? It's like a whole other category that people don't recognize. And they also talked about people who struggle with being single and helping them with some challenges that in their lives that maybe are keeping them from moving forward in their life.
I was thinking about a good friend of mine. It's not my wisdom, it's his, and of course all wisdom is really God's wisdom, but he used to talk about the importance of when we're single. I know I was single at the time we were having that conversation, of becoming who we want to attract. Mm-hmm. That if we want someone who's healthy and well and has a deep relationship with Christ, because human beings tend to be attracted to people who are relatively in the same place as they are. Now, that doesn't mean you're exactly the same. It means the level of wellness, the depth of faith, those things are similar. And so I love hearing that, because that really affirms that for me, that maybe what's holding people back sometimes is themselves. And that's not an accusatory or punitive thing. It's an encouragement to say, you actually have more control than you think about whom you attract into your life. And it's God encouraging you to get right with him first. And then, it's seek ye first the kingdom again, and then these things will be given unto you. So that's super cool.
Thank you.
It also made me think about something Tommy's been talking about recently, Lori, when you were talking about kind of that weird place people are in where they don't exactly fit. Because Tommy's been talking about premarital.
Yes.
And talk about that a little bit, Tommy.
So here we recognize that we do premarital. We have a really good PreMarital program. But what are we doing for people who are not engaged? Maybe people are dating, maybe they're not dating at all. And it's not a competition with our YA, because that's young adults. But we're talking about folks who are, I think it's 26 and above, which would not fall into the YA category, and just helping them figure out their identity. And we're going to talk a little about order here in a moment. But just make sure they have the order correct, and not, and we think about Mark 12, loving God with everything we have, and making God our first love, and doing that well. So then we're seeking out our spouse. We can make sure that we're seeking out using biblical filters.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Lori, coming back to you, can you talk specifically about, and I don't think I'm sharing anything that hasn't been shared on the podcast before. You're dating somebody,
yes,
but you're not engaged,
right? And
right now there's no immediate plans to be married,
right?
So as you were in this breakout session about single, you're not single,
right?
Right. So talk about that a little bit, and kind of maybe what they said or what you were thinking as they were talking.
Well, that is a real thing, because I'm not single. I'm with someone that I'm committed to. We aren't engaged. We aren't, we're not close to being engaged, but we're committed, and we're not dating other people, and we have no desire to date other people. I think for me, a little bit, it's the validation of who we are. It makes you feel like you're just in a whole other category that is left out of things sometimes. And it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just new territory like anything else. And thank you for rescuing me a minute ago, as you said what I was trying to say so much better. But something else I wanted to say was, it was also something they said I thought was really good, because a lot of times, there are people who are single who are desperate to not be single, to be with someone, and people, put everything else aside and chase after things that aren't necessarily really for them. And obviously it's important to grow your relationship with Christ first and be the person that God wants you to be and all of those things. But I also sometimes think that we tell people that they don't need to look for a spouse. They don't need to look for a companion. That's not something you need to look for. And I think that desire is okay. And they did acknowledge that when in their talk. They said that, obviously this is not a dating service, but we acknowledge that people, we're made to live in community, and, and they acknowledge that.
Yeah, we're made in God's image, and God is a communal God.
Right.
That's right.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and where would you rather people meet? A bar? I mean,
yes,
a lot
exactly.
of times churches cringe at the idea of a meat market, but as long as you're putting healthy boundaries and structure around it, isn't that the best place to meet somebody, especially if you're a Christian?
Yes.
You want to meet other Christians? I mean, I know we have Christian Mingle and all these things online, but still, I think the best place to meet somebody is to meet them in person.
I agree.
And you get to hear them and see them and really know that they're walking out. What better place is there?
Yeah.
Now, if you're coming there and you're not paying attention to any of the programming or formatting, and you came there strictly to look for a date, I think that's going to show itself at some point.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And that's a corrective moment. But I don't think we need to fear that. I think that's a great place to meet people.
We actually had a situation like that a few years ago at church on a Sunday. So, but that's another discussion for another day.
Well, I'm really excited about the idea of premarital, because that's something that we talk about in our single and parenting group too, is, so many of us want to move on to healthy relationships because we've come from ones that were less than healthy, and we don't know what that looks like. We don't know how to do that,
Yeah.
and some guidance
That's good.
would be good. So.
Tommy,
So as we turn the corner,
Yeah.
I'm going to talk a little about marriage. And so marriage is near and dear to my heart. And they had a marriage breakout class. So I just kind of want to talk about that a little bit here. So I'll try to keep it under just a couple minutes here. One thing they talked about was these, what they called the 5 habits to help marriage succeed, to help your marriage thrive. And basically those 5 are: clarify your calling, predetermine your pace, examine your expectations. 4 is find your friends, and 5 is strengthen your soul. And so I just really want to talk about the first 3, because those are the way they talked about is very unique. And so examine your expectations, and one thing I thought was interesting is I've been reading a book about marriage, and there was a term in there he used called prepared spontaneity. And he's saying that, like, the way that life shakes out is not the way we plan. I mean, even our best plans are still faulty. And so basically what he's saying is, like, while we may not know what tomorrow brings, it doesn't mean we still can't prepare now.
Mm-hmm.
And so examining expectations, and trying to make sure you vocalize that, share with your spouse what's on your heart. Like, what is it? What is your thinking? What is it that you mean when you do say something? So it really requires a lot of communication. And I know that's tough. I'm gonna press in for a little bit, guys. Historically, we don't do well with communicating.
Right.
And so, not to pick on you guys, because I'm a guy too, and I fail at communicating. So guess what? We're all in the same broken boat together. But we need to communicate well, and we need to be intentional about that.
And Tommy, I know you probably do some of this in the premarital, but also just our society especially, and I imagine this is worldwide, but I know more about U.S. culture and society. We set up these expectations culturally, the whole knight in shining armor and Cinderella, and this person's going to complete me, and I'm going to be happy once I'm married, and just all the sort of, I'll say, fairy tale fantasy things that come along with the relationship. And that may sound silly, but those things become buried deep in our consciousness.
Oh, yeah.
And they become subconscious, and we walk into relationships with these. And I think if you're a member here and you're thinking about getting married, I'd love you to come talk to Tommy or myself. If you're not and you're listening from far away, or just you're a part of another church, if you're considering getting married, it's worth bringing a third, a counselor, a pastor, somebody into conversation with your significant other and having these like not only just your personal expectations, but maybe these high level expectations.
Yeah. And they talked a little about what he calls the frustration gap, the expectation versus reality and what that happens. And, they use the example. He said, if I say I'm going to be 5 minutes late, I'm 5 minutes late. Well, they expect 5 minutes is 5 minutes. But if he says I'm going to be 5 minutes late and it's 5 hours, that's a big difference.
Right.
And so it just creates frustration. So the other two things I just want to briefly touch on is predetermining your pace is what they talked about. Basically, it's getting down and lining out your calendar. And so if I can be candid, I think I threw Tom off for a loop about a week and a half ago. I think you know where I'm going to go with this. So when I sent off my Jill and I were sitting down planning out 2022, and I must have fired off, I don't know, maybe about 10 vacation requests
that's
or something,
right.
like 10 individual days or something like that. And Tom's like, what's going on? And I'm like, sorry, we were just doing 2022 planning, but it helps because you can start mapping things out and putting things into place. And so just really focusing on your pace and understand we don't have to keep up with the Joneses. You don't have to do everything every season. Like, hey, take this season and do that. Take this season and rest.
Tease that out a little bit more for folks. What are we talking about when you're talking about marriage? What are we talking about pacing?
Yeah. So, for example, like it's very important for Jill to know that we have a date night, that we have some type of a unplug moment, whether it be change the zip code for 24 hours or go on a family vacation or something like that. And when I say family vacation, I'm talking like we're going to go to the beach, put our feet in the sand. So, but yeah, so just being intentional about that and telling your spouse, look, this is a priority. These are the things you want to do over the next 12 months. I want to do those things too. And let's put our heads together. Let's talk about it. And let's put it on a calendar.
That's good.
Yeah. In a way that's sustainable. And then the last thing I want to talk about is they talked about clarifying your calling. And I talked about this a lot I haven't used that terminology, but I've talked about order in sessions, premarital, marital distress, all kinds of things. And they really touched on this, and it was really cool to see that they're both on the same page. And that is that their number one love, so his and hers, their number one love is God first. And they said, hey, my husband's number one love is going to be God. My wife's number one love is going to be God. And they both agreed on it. And then their second love was each other. So we see that from Mark 12. And then their children, and then all other things. And so, when we see that, we see that they're being intentional about their priorities. And also within that too, we think about words like, I know that, and again, I want to talk to the women here for a moment, that word submit can be really, it's a hot button word, but that word submit, it actually has to do with order and structure.
I feel like I've talked a lot already, and I want you guys to all feel like you can jump in because everybody has shared really good stuff, and we haven't talked a whole bunch about what we took away. We like Callie was saying, we did a little bit over dinner, or we further discussed something. But it's been cool for me today to hear you guys and kind of what your takeaways were. I'm going to give kind of maybe a big takeaway or an overview of what we were discussing at the conference. Ricky Jenkins, who was the first pastor to speak, really kind of set the tone, and the tone was, as we quote unquote come back, who are we going to be? Are we going to be like Jesus? And if we're going to be like Jesus, our one weapon, our one tool is love. And that kind of set the tone for the whole conference. And for me, I hate to say it this way. I don't want to say it like it's what I needed to hear or even wanted to hear, but I think it was important to hear. It was important for me to go, yes, numbers are one way a church measures success, and it's always going to be that way, and I understand why, but that should never be the goal. The goal should be making mature Christians who know how to love the way Christ loves us. And I think COVID in some regard has forced churches to see that we're going to have to focus more on the quality of our relationships, the amount of love that we're giving out. And so a quote I wrote down, I was talking to the team about this prior to the podcast, is we talked a lot about pastors that really struggled over this last year and a half. And it's not just pastors, it's leaders, it's people. I don't want to make this all about pastors. but just the idea that a lot of people feel really burned out.
Mm-hmm.
And here's one big reason we feel burned out, and I like this. It's by Rebecca Lyons was one of the speakers, and this was a quote from her. Burnout is when you give out of something you haven't received. I'll say that again. Burnout is when you give out of something you haven't received. We can't love if we're not soaking in Christ's love. And we can't love if we don't feel loved. Because I don't believe that Jesus' love is something he gives and takes, or it flows sometimes and it doesn't flow others. Mm-hmm. So if we're not feeling that, if we're not receiving Christ's love, it's because we're not receiving Christ's love. Mm-hmm. Either there is unconfessed sin and something blocking the light of the Spirit and God's love, or we simply have believed a lie that we're not deserving of that. And maybe I'll add a third. And the third might be that we're simply not taking time with the Lord. Yeah. Because like every relationship takes time and focus. Mm-hmm. And so it was awesome to be at a conference with other believers and with leaders and pastors who were going, you know what? At the end of the day, what's important is being loved by Christ and going out and sharing that love with other people. Mm-hmm. And if we really want to mark success, then the mark of success is how we love others. And that was, for me, the sort of global takeaway, if you will. We had Chris Brown, who is the pastor of North Coast Church, share with us at the very end. And I won't go into his story other than to say he shared his struggle over the last year and a half. And kind of where the Lord led him and took him. And he was struggling with not only loving people, but even liking them because of all the adversity and things that were happening. Mm-hmm. And I think he realized at the end of the day that he had overcomplicated things. And so if you don't get anything else out of the podcast, or you go, well, that's great that you guys went to this conference, but, you know, I wasn't there. If you can just take away that we have the next big, church campaign. We've got a tactic. We've got a new formula. We've got a new book to read. We complicate our faith and we complicate our lives. If we can boil it down to be loved and love, right? Love God with all your mind, heart, soul, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. Mm-hmm. That's what it always comes back to. Mm-hmm. If we do that, then our church is successful. If we do that, our life is successful. And if we do that, we're in God's will. That can look a lot of different ways for a lot of different people, but that's still, I think, the bottom line. And that's my
doing it open-handedly.
That's my big takeaway. I mean, that was huge for me.
Well, as we get to wrap up, we're reminded that prayer is primary. And Callie, do you mind praying us out?
Yeah. Dear God, just thank you so much for the opportunity for us to go to that conference, just to hear you speak clearly, and just how you've spoken to us so differently, us four individuals. And so I just want to thank you for that. I want to thank you for just being present and allowing that conference to be there for so many leaders to just be a part of. Lord, I want to thank you for whoever's listening right now. I hope that it encouraged them and that it speaks to them, Lord. I just pray that the people listening just find moments of stillness with you, that they can just sit and be present, that they can just listen, and Lord, they can be honest with you, because God, you value our honesty. And so, God, I just pray that sometimes I feel like we have to look and act and be a certain way to follow you, Lord, but you want us for who we are. And so I just pray that we're able to be transparent with you, because God, when we're honest with you and when we're seeking you, you transform our hearts. And so, God, I just pray that if someone's listening to this and just feels distant from you, Lord, that they just make that space, and that your love just floods them. So just thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for the podcast, and just thank you for whoever's listening. God, we're so thankful for you. We trust you and we love you, and it's in your name that we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Well, I'll tell you, we could really talk a lot about that conference. That was good stuff. So, but don't forget, you can check us out every Thursday morning, 7 a.m. to catch this episode or others. And you can see us on Facebook, Amazon, Spotify, Apple, or YouTube. You can also go to mynorthside.com/care for additional resources. We love you guys. We'll catch you next week.